It's a very sad story. And I got to know him. He was such a beautiful man, such a lovely man. Somewhere I saw footage and I saw this thing and I thought, well, surely you've seen this. That was a loss that clearly had a huge effect. This story, and it's absolutely unbelievable.
Look at him with his head kind of shaved. And I don't know if that's what he looked like, but he looks like he's got a screw or an evil screw. So he was 32 years old. He was at a holiday party hosted by Conan O'Brien.
Rob Reiner and Nick got into a, quote, very loud argument. His behavior at Conan's house alarmed the guests because it was so bizarre. One of the guests recalled Rob Reiner telling his son his behavior was inappropriate.
Nick attended Conan O'Brien's Christmas party. He was wearing a hoodie. Reports are that he was acting weird, apparently accosting celebrities outside. Nick reportedly stormed off in a huff after a tiff with Bill Hader of SNL and Barry at Conan's Christmas party, and that Rob had been telling people, friends, that they were scared for Nick and scared for his mental state, that it was deteriorating.
9 days after the death of legendary filmmaker Rob Reiner, something in Hollywood quietly shifted. Not in the headlines, not in the press releases, but in the faces of those who knew him best. Sources close to the industry say that late-night host Conan O'Brien, usually the calm in every storm, had been holding it together until he wasn't. At a private gathering, when conversation turned to Rob, Conan reportedly went silent. Those in the room recall the air changing, as if an unspoken truth hovered between every word. He didn't talk about fame, he didn't mention awards, legacy, or Hollywood stories. He talked about one night, a single evening that, according to public narratives, haunted him long after Rob was gone. A night that wasn't about cameras, comedy, or careers, but about connection. And the moment it broke, those who've heard Conan's account describe it as raw, fragmented, and deeply human. He didn't make claims, he expressed regret. The kind of regret that sits in silence long after laughter fades.
Conan O'Brien telling guests at the party who wanted to call 911 to not do so. Obviously, Conan O'Brien is not responsible for this man's behavior.
What really happened that night? Why did Conan believe that moment mattered more than any other? No one can say for sure, but as pieces of the story surfaced through whispers, tributes, and late-night reflection, one thing became clear. Sometimes the loudest stories in Hollywood are the ones told in silence. This story is about understanding, not accusation, and every detail shared here is meant to bring context, not conclusion. The story began quietly, a conversation that, by most accounts, should have meant nothing. It wasn't dramatic or heated, it was simple, familiar, but something beneath it felt wrong. Those close to Conan O'Brien remember that night as one he couldn't forget. He'd spoken with Rob Reiner not long before his passing, and something about the exchange lingered like static, faint, uneasy, impossible to shake. In the retellings shared among colleagues and friends, Conan's recollection carried a strange weight. He didn't describe panic or fear, just a feeling that Rob's energy was dimmer. Tired, maybe? Not physically, but emotionally spent. The way someone sounds when they've been holding up the world too long. Later, when asked about that period, Conan admitted there was something he wished he'd said, a question he wished he'd asked, but it was one of those ordinary moments that never seemed urgent until it was too late. What made that night unforgettable wasn't what was said, but what was left unsaid, a hesitation, a silence that now echoes louder than any joke or interview could. People who've seen Conan reflect on that evening describe a man wrestling with memory, trying to understand how something so small could come to mean everything. And for Conan, that quiet exchange became the moment he couldn't move past, the night that refused to fade. In the days following Rob Reiner's passing, people close to Conan O'Brien noticed a shift in him, a quiet weight that didn't show on camera. He kept working, smiling, joking, but the spark behind the laughter seemed muted.
If they had called and Rob Reiner's son was placed on a psychiatric hold, Rob Reiner and his wife would probably still be alive today.
During a small gathering, accounts suggest that Conan finally spoke about the night he last spoke to Rob. It wasn't a speech or a eulogy, more like a confession that slipped out mid-conversation. His tone cracked, his words slowed, and those listening said the room fell silent. He reportedly admitted he'd almost called Rob back that night. Almost, but he didn't, not because of indifference, but because he thought there would always be more time. That hesitation became the thought that replayed endlessly after the news broke. He didn't say it out of guilt. He said it out of recognition, the painful realization that sometimes the smallest decisions carry the heaviest echoes. Observers later described that moment as raw and human, not performative. Conan wasn't sharing a story. He was revisiting a fracture, the idea that one brief pause, one unmade call, could live in memory longer than any success or joke ever would.
Conan O'Brien stopped a friend from calling 911 during an explosive fight between Rob and Nick Reiner at the comedian's Christmas party, just hours before the director's son allegedly took his parents' lives.
Those who were there remember his final words that evening, soft, uncertain, and almost inaudible. "I should have called back. No accusation, no blame, just the sound of regret, the kind that never fully fades." Accounts from people familiar with that final conversation between Conan O'Brien and Rob Reiner describe it as ordinary on the surface. A quick check-in, filled with the kind of dry humor both men were known for. But behind the laughter, there was something faintly different. Conan, in later reflections shared publicly, hinted that Rob's tone carried an unfamiliar weight. He sounded tired, not from work, but from something deeper. The kind of exhaustion that sits quietly behind forced smiles. Still, nothing in his words suggested crisis or alarm. It was the absence of anything dramatic that made it so haunting in hindsight. Those close to Conan say he mentioned that after hanging up, he felt an odd sense of stillness. Not dread, just quiet. The kind that leaves a question you can't quite name. He dismissed it at the time. Everyone has off days, he told himself. Yet when news of Rob's passing reached him, that same stillness returned, sharper this time, replaying every second of that call. The unsettling part wasn't that something happened during the conversation, it's that nothing did. No goodbye, no final thought, no sign that it would be their last exchange. In every retelling, that's what stands out. Not the words spoken, but the ones that never came. The silence between them became the sound he could never forget. As conversations about Rob Reiner's final days began to circulate, attention inevitably turned toward his son, Nick Reiner.
One source tells NBC News that Nick allegedly interrupted a discussion involving comedian Bill Hader. After Bill told him it was a private conversation, Nick reportedly stood still and stared before, quote, storming off. E! News has reached out to representatives for Bill Hader for comment. 32-year-old Nick was arrested the next day for suspicion of murder and is currently being held without bail.
Public reports noted that Nick had been taken into custody as part of the investigation surrounding his father's death, a development that sent shockwaves through Hollywood. While official details remained limited, discussions across media and among colleagues painted a picture of a strained relationship long before that night. People familiar with the family dynamic described it as distant, complicated, filled with love but clouded by frustration and misunderstanding. Those who knew them say Rob tried to reach his son in recent months, but the conversations often ended unfinished, tense, or silent. Nick, meanwhile, appeared to be fighting personal battles few understood. The result was a growing emotional gap that neither seemed able to bridge. When Conan O'Brien later spoke publicly about Rob, his tone reportedly shifted at the mention of Nick. There was no judgment, no defense, only a sadness that seemed to recognize how fractured things had become. Observers interpreted his reaction as that of a man mourning more than one loss, the loss of a friend, and the loss of the connection that might have healed a family before everything fell apart. Whatever the truth behind that night, one thing became clear: silence didn't just separate friends, it separated blood. According to public timelines and accounts from those nearby, the night everything unraveled began quietly. No shouting, no visible argument, just a stillness that settled over Rob Reiner's home, the kind of silence that feels too heavy to be ordinary. Investigators later described the scene as calm but unsettling, as if life had paused mid-sentence. Nothing was broken, nothing out of place, yet those who had spoken to Rob in the days before said something in his tone had shifted, a subtle detachment, like a man trying to step away from his own world. Reports suggest that in the hours leading up to that night, Rob and Nick had crossed paths briefly.
Multiple attendees have reported seeing Rob, 78, and his wife, Michelle, 70, having a heated argument with the 32-year-old Nick at O'Brien's LA mansion on Saturday night. Nick is said to have been behaving erratically all evening, but one source familiar with the party has now told the Daily Mail that the spat grew so intense that at least one guest suggested calling the cops to intervene.
What was said, if anything, remains unclear, but in the days following, the distance between father and son became the center of every conversation. Conan O'Brien, in his later reflections, never spoke of that night's details. He only hinted that it marked a turning point, not just for those involved, but for everyone who'd ever mistaken silence for peace. For many, the tragedy wasn't defined by one event, but by a gradual fading of connection that no one recognized until it was gone. By the time the truth began to surface, one thing was undeniable. Whatever ended that night, it didn't begin there. It had been building quietly in every unspoken word that came before. In the months that followed, Conan O'Brien's reflections grew quieter, more deliberate. He didn't speak often about Rob Reiner's passing, but when he did, those who listened said his words carried the weight of hindsight, the kind that doesn't seek answers, only understanding. In interviews and private conversations, Conan hinted that he had replayed that final exchange countless times, wondering if something small, a longer pause, a second call, a simple question, might have shifted the path that followed. It wasn't about saving a life, it was about interrupting a moment. Observers noted that he began to speak more openly about presence, the idea that sometimes being persistent in care can alter someone's direction, even briefly. His message wasn't dramatic or moralizing, it was simple: check in, even when it feels unnecessary. Friends and colleagues saw this belief reflected in his tone whenever loss was mentioned. He often spoke of how people tend to underestimate quiet gestures, a visit, a text, a question asked twice. To him, these weren't just niceties, they were lifelines.
But Conan O'Brien stepped in and said, "It's my house, my party, and I'm not calling the police." He talked him out of calling the police. Conan O'Brien, 62, did not respond to the Daily Mail's request for comment. Another source corroborated the account, saying party guests had raised concerns about Nick's mental state and suggested contacting the cops before O'Brien shut the idea down. When ish was hitting the fan, someone said, "We need to call the police." The conversation was about getting his kid put on a mental health hold, the second source told the Daily Mail. Now, to be very clear,
while no one could rewrite what had already happened, Conan's reflections became a quiet reminder of how fragile moments can be. It wasn't guilt that haunted him, it was possibility. The thought that something so small might have mattered, if only he had known. In the aftermath of Rob Reiner's death, the conversations around Hollywood shifted, not publicly, but in the quiet corners of sets, green rooms, and studios. Those close to the industry began reflecting on a truth few wanted to admit, that behind the glamour, there's an unspoken rule of emotional distance. Actors, writers, and hosts are taught to perform through pain, to smile, to deliver, to keep the show moving. Vulnerability becomes a private act, hidden behind applause and studio lights. In that culture, concern often feels like intrusion, and silence is mistaken for respect. People who've worked alongside Conan O'Brien noted that this experience changed how he saw that world. He started to notice how easily people disappear behind their own schedules, how many times he'd ask, "You good?" without really waiting for an answer. Industry insiders later described his shift as subtle but profound. He began using humor less as a shield and more as connection. Yet even then, the lesson lingered, that fame doesn't insulate people from loneliness, it amplifies it. The uncomfortable reality, as many have since echoed, is that Hollywood rewards composure more than honesty. And in that system, pain often hides in plain sight until it's too late to notice.
If convicted, Reiner could face life in prison without the possibility of parole or even the death sentence.
Having the death penalty on the table is absolutely a bargaining chip. The prosecution is going to leverage that to try to get some sort of deal.
In a statement, the couple's two other children, Jake and Romy Reiner, said, "Word cannot even begin to describe the unimaginable pain we are experiencing. They weren't just our parents, they were our best friends."
For Conan, that realization was the hardest truth of all. No one saw what was breaking because everyone was too busy pretending not to. As the story continued to spread across news outlets and social media, interpretations began to take on lives of their own. Speculation blurred with sympathy, and fragments of conversations were turned into narratives that no one directly confirmed. Through all of it, one point remained important. This story doesn't claim to reveal secrets or expose hidden crimes. Public discussions surrounding Rob and Nick Reiner's situation have come from reports, statements, and scattered recollections, not official conclusions. What remains verifiable is that a family was broken, a friend was grieving, and the world was trying to make sense of what could never fully be explained. Those who followed Conan O'Brien's reflections know he has never accused, defended, or theorized. His words, as captured in interviews and tributes, have focused on emotion rather than evidence, on the pain of losing someone, not the process of proving anything. Observers describe his comments as a meditation on regret, not responsibility. They reflect what many feel after loss, the haunting replay of moments that can never be changed, and the quiet question of what might have been different. This isn't a story of blame, it's a story of memory, of how grief distorts time, turning ordinary moments into symbols. And in that sense, every detail shared is less about fact and more about feeling, the way truth often lives between what happened and how it's remembered. In the end, the story wasn't about a single night or a single mistake. It was about the fragile space between people, the space that can change everything if left unspoken for too long. Conan O'Brien's reflections, as shared through interviews and recollections, reminded many that the real warning signs in life aren't always loud. They don't come with alarms or clear endings. Sometimes they're just pauses, a hesitation in a voice, a missed call, a conversation that feels slightly off but goes ignored. The deeper message buried beneath the heartbreak is one that resonates far beyond Hollywood. That connection requires courage. The courage to ask again, to reach out twice, to say the words that feel uncomfortable but necessary. And while the truth behind that night remains wrapped in speculation and silence, the lesson it leaves behind is painfully clear, that love, friendship, and understanding can only save us when we stop assuming there's more time. If this story left you thinking, our previous investigation explored the final report shared by Rob Reiner's wife, a deeply personal account that revealed 7 haunting and emotional details about their final days together. It's a story that adds another layer to this tragedy, one that's both heartbreaking and human. You're watching Celeb Spotlight, where the fame fades and the truth begins to speak. This video reflects a narrative shaped by public conversation.